Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now proceed with the interactive dialogue with the Commission of Inquiry to investigate all alleged human rights violations in Eritrea. Delegations wishing to inscribe on the list of speakers should do so by using the electronic system, which will be opened very shortly. But before we open it, it is my pleasure to welcome to the podium the members of the Commission of Inquiry, Mr. Mike Smith, Ms. Sheila Keitharuth, and Mr. Victor Dankwa. Before I give the floor to the mandate holders, I would like to ask the Secretariat now to activate the electronic system for the inscription on the list of speakers. You have 1 minute to inscribe on the list of speakers. And after the minute has lapsed, we will show the provisional list on the screen. The list of speakers will finally close then in 15 minutes. We'll wait for the minute to pass. Right. Before I will give the floor to the chairperson of the Commission, I would like to inform you about the following. It has been brought to my attention that the members of the Commission. Before I give the floor to the chairperson, I would like to bring to your attention the following. It has been brought to my attention that the members of the Commission of Inquiry on Eritrea have been subjected to various threats and acts of intimidation in their hotel and in the streets since their arrival in Geneva. Security around members of the Commission has had to be redoubled and contacts established with the host country's police. We have also taken security measures to ensure that the interactive dialogue proceed with calm and dignity. Substantive disagreement with members of the COI or other mandate holders can always be expressed. It is, however, totally unacceptable for them to be subjected to threats and intimidation in the context of discharging their mandates, which are established by the United Nations Human Rights Council. As President of the Council, I will follow up at the Bureau level on this and all other related cases that are brought to my attention. Having said this, I would now like to invite Mr. Mike Smith, Chairperson of the Commission of Inquiry on Eritrea, to present the report of the Commission pursuant to Council Resolution 26/24, if possible within 10 minutes. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Deputy High Commissioner, distinguished members of the Human Rights Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. More than 2 decades have passed since Eritrea emerged as a newly independent nation, full of hope for a free and prosperous future for all its citizens. Unfortunately, that promise remains unfulfilled. Today, the dream of a democratic Eritrea free of human rights violations seems more distant than ever. The Eritrea we see today is marked by repression and fear. Since independence, ultimate power in Eritrea has remained largely in the hands of one man and one party. Those in control often rule arbitrarily and act with impunity. A promising Eritrean constitution, adopted in 1997, has never been implemented. The Eritrean people have no say in governance and little control over many aspects of their own lives. A massive domestic surveillance network penetrates all levels of society, turning even family members against each other. Much of the population is subject to forced conscription and labour, sometimes in slave-like conditions. Tens of thousands have been imprisoned, often without charge and for indeterminate periods. Eritreans have never voted in a free and fair election. Hundreds of thousands have lost hope and are risking their lives to escape one of the world's most oppressive regimes. The number fleeing such a small country, estimated at 5,000 people each month, is forcing the outside world to take notice. Eritrea's dire human rights situation can no longer be ignored. Over the past several months, our Commission of Inquiry has found that systematic, widespread and gross human rights violations have been and are still being committed with impunity in Eritrea. Our findings are sobering. The many violations in Eritrea are of a scope and scale seldom seen anywhere else in today's world. Basic freedoms are curtailed from movement to expression, from religion to association. The Commission finds that crimes against humanity may have occurred with regard to torture, extrajudicial executions, forced labour, and in the context of national service. The non-implementation of Eritrea's 1997 constitution has had a profound effect on the country and its people. With no parliament meeting and a court system controlled by the executive branch of the government, it can be said there is no rule of law operating in Eritrea. Violations of the right to fair trial and due process are particularly blatant. Torture is often used to obtain statements. Judgments are rarely made public or even communicated to the accused. Arbitrary arrest is common, often ordered by any person with de facto authority. Scores of people have been victims of enforced disappearances, including journalists, political dissidents, religious leaders and adherents, and members of minority ethnic groups. Given the widespread nature of human rights violations over many years in Eritrea, a culture of impunity is firmly entrenched throughout the country. Bringing this pervasive culture of impunity to an end is obviously a daunting task, but essential for any genuine efforts to improve the human rights situation in the country. The Commission recommends that the government start the process by acknowledging the existence of human rights violations and ensuring accountability for them, including but not limited to extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, torture, unlawful detention, sexual violence, including in the national service, and forced labour. This should include establishment of an independent and impartial mechanism to investigate and, where appropriate, bring perpetrators to justice, particularly those with command responsibility. Victims should receive adequate redress. Ladies and gentlemen, in addition to human rights violations reported by the Special Rapporteur on Eritrea, by CEDAW, by the CRC, and most recently by the ILO Committee on the Application of Standards, the Commission has identified new patterns of violations under the repressive system used by the Eritrean government to control, silence and isolate individuals. Eritrean authorities intentionally use torture in the course of detention. The harshest conditions and the strictest regimes of detention are deliberately employed to punish so-called traitors, those believed to be a threat to national security or suspected of cross-border crimes. It is also used to obtain statements of self-incrimination, to extract a confession or information, or to force religious believers to renounce their faith. Another pattern involves the routine, systematic use of certain methods of torture on conscripts and detainees. Ill treatment and torture are an established feature of the interrogation process and is routine during military training and in the army. The recurrence, coherence and similarities of the many torture accounts heard by the Commission are a clear indication of the existence of a deliberate policy. Under the pretext of defending the integrity of the state and ensuring national self-sufficiency, The government has subjected much of the population to open-ended national service, either in the army or through the civil service. On turning 18 or even before, all Eritreans are conscripted. While national service is supposed to last 18 months, in reality, conscripts end up serving for an indefinite period, often for years in harsh and inhumane conditions. We collected several testimonies of conscripts having been in the national service for periods exceeding more than a decade. The Commission concluded that forced labour in this context is a practice similar to slavery in its effects, and as such is prohibited under international human rights law. Imagine the impact of this uncertainty on young Eritreans who lose all control over their own futures. Is it any wonder that Eritreans, most of them young people, are the second largest nationality after Syrians to resort to seaborne smugglers to cross the Mediterranean to Europe? Many cite indefinite conscription as a reason for fleeing. Having lost all hope in their own country, they risk their lives to escape a dire human rights situation and a bleak future. This is a tragedy both for them and for their home country, which can ill afford to continue losing its youth. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, placed the number of Eritreans under its concern outside the country at nearly 417,000 by the end of 2014. The Commission urges the international community to continue to provide protection to Eritreans fleeing human rights violations and warns against sending them back to danger in a country that punishes anyone who tries to leave without permission. Returning Eritreans to their country of origin can put them in danger of arbitrary arrest, detention, ill treatment and forced labour. The Commission also has documented cases of the relatives of people who have fled the country being arbitrarily arrested in retaliation. In engaging with the Eritrean authorities on solutions to stem the flow of asylum seekers, the international community should place human rights considerations at the forefront of any package of proposed abatement measures, and it should insist on tangible progress on human rights in Eritrea. The Commission would like to emphasise that it repeatedly sought the cooperation of the government of Eritrea in carrying out its work, but received no response to our requests. The government of Eritrea described on 9 June the findings of the Commission as, quote, an attack not so much on the government, but on a civilised people and a society who cherish human values and dignity, unquote. With respect, we, the Commission, are recording the voices of real Eritrean people as articulated in the 550 testimonies and 160 submissions received. We also reflect the silenced voices of the majority of Eritreans who have never been able to elect their own representatives in national, free, fair and democratic elections. The voices of imprisoned and ill-treated critics, journalists, religious leaders and others who have disappeared into a vast network of jails. The muzzled voices of those subjected to forced labour and inhumane conditions for years on end, and the voices of those who every day risk their lives to flee a government that has failed them and all of the others. The testimonies collected by the Commission include Eritreans who fled their country as recently as February 2015. Contrary to government pronouncements, those testimonies indicate little has changed in recent years. Arbitrary arrests, detention, including incommunicado, enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, widespread ill-treatment and torture continue. It is high time that the government of Eritrea truly endeavours to improve the human rights of its people. We need to see real progress, not just words. The President of Eritrea has announced that a new constitution is being drafted, but no one knows who is in charge of that task and whether it will be submitted for approval by the people or their representatives. Similarly, the government announced that the length of national service will be reduced to 18 months as of 2014, but it is impossible to verify the implementation because the decision appears to apply only to those conscripted in 2014, not before. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now the responsibility of the Council to keep the human rights situation in Eritrea under close scrutiny. The Commission strongly recommends the extension of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. The Council may also decide on further investigations to establish whether crimes against humanity have actually occurred in Eritrea. It is time for true commitment and real change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me state that the list of speakers will close in no later than 15 minutes. And we shall now start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned. I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea. You have 5 minutes for your statement.
Mr. President, we have already communicated our response to the report of the COI, but in today's deliberation, therefore, I will not go to detailed rebuttal, but to highlight some of the salient features. I ask the Secretariat to consider the longer version of this statement, which has been circulated to this room as part of the official statement, but in the interest of time, I will read a shorter version of it. 1. Eritrea remains under UN sanctions since 2009. However, there is growing consensus these days, including in the capitals of the principal sponsors of the resolutions, that the punitive measures meted against Eritrea were based on heresy and trumped-up charges. But the fact is the sanctions have exacted huge economic and development costs to a small and young nation. And despite current regrets and second thoughts, they remain in force due to the procedural hurdles, diplomatic inertia, and continued hostility by some principal players and powers. 2. The evidence strongly suggests that this entire episode was conceived from the outset to serve as a substitute and fallback option to the UN Security Council imposed sanctions in order to continuously harass Eritrea for ulterior political motives. Notwithstanding the impediments and ongoing violations of the principles, however, an expanded paradigm of engagement encompassing cooperation with the OHCHR, consultation to initiate work with the thematic mandate holders and treaty bodies, bilateral engagement with states and missions accredited to Eritrea and abroad, and cooperation with the UN country team have been initiated, and concrete steps have also been taken. 3. Eritrea has reasons to believe that the Commission has deliberately shortchanged its investigative mission to bolster preconceived, politically motivated conclusions and recommendations. Indeed, the Commission acknowledged that it has colored its report from interviews of 550 Eritrean asylum seekers and written submissions of other 160 Eritrean citizens abroad. In the first place, this cannot be an appropriate sample. Eritreans in the diaspora are close to 1 million, to infer sweeping indictment of a sovereign nation and its government. More importantly, the Commission's highly subjective standards of proof and validation, which it describes as reasonable grounds to believe, is ill-suited to ascertain potentially fallacious testimonies of asylum seekers or well-known individuals who espouse different, even subversive, political agendas. In fact, the Commission routinely disregarded various reports by UN agencies in Eritrea, testimonies and submissions by reputable foreign business companies that operate in the country, corporate ethical audits carried out by independent and reputable foreign agencies, as well as testimonies and submissions by Eritrean communities. We know of courageous individuals who approached the Commission to disavow the typical false asylum testimonies they had filed in their new country of domicile at the risk of facing legal charges of perjury. But all these evidences were neither assessed nor cited and acknowledged in its reports. The fact that thousands of Eritreans from all over Europe have demonstrated against the report yesterday is in itself a live witness to the Council. The Commission carelessly dismisses the existential threats that Eritrea has and is still facing. It recommends with amazing imprudence and insensitivity for the international community and the United Nations to assist Eritrea and Ethiopia to solve the border issues through diplomatic means. Obviously, the Commission is either ignorant or does not care to note that the border issue has long been settled through an international arbitral process on the basis of a UN-guaranteed Algiers Peace Agreement that the Ethiopia Boundary Commission had deposited in November 2007 the exact coordinates of the boundary at the UN Cartographic Office, and that the United Nations itself is keenly aware that Ethiopia remains in flagrant violation of international law, although it has not taken appropriate steps of enforcement due to US blockade. 5. To draw another parallel with the Somalia-Eritrea Monitoring Group, a crucial drawback that crippled the SEMG objective work was the compromising political association of some of its members with some countries. As you may know, one of the Somalia-Eritrea Monitoring Group officials was dismissed recently when it was ascertained that he was openly advocating regime change in a confidential letter he had written to a former official of the government. Unfortunately, Eritrea has reasons to believe that some officials of the Commission belong to the same league. The personal political persuasions and affiliations of Commission members are not of interest to Eritrea. But it is another matter if this has to do with the way domestic politics and governance are conducted in Eritrea. In the event Eritrea wishes to draw attention to this august body that the Commission has members within its ranks that espouse sinister political agendas against Eritrea due to their close and unorthodox association with subversive groups. In conclusion,
Please come to an end.
I'm making the conclusion. In conclusion, the bleak narrative on human rights in Eritrea that the Commission has portrayed is widely at variance with the prevailing reality in the country. Yes, there are shortcomings, and I have no intention to claim that everything is rosy in my country. In any case, these have been and are being addressed within the UPR process and engagements. Eritrea is indeed a young nation that's facing numerous problems, a big part of which has to do with externally induced existential challenges. In spite of all these challenges, Eritrea's institutions are evolving at a reasonable and healthy pace. Its economy is progressing steadily and ready for takeoff after much hard work. To ignore all these realities and falsely indict Eritrea to advance the political agenda of certain powers will thus constitute a huge travesty of justice that cannot be excused under any pretext. In this connection, I want to mention that if what has been mentioned about the intimidation of the members of the Commission is right, it's a very sad revelation, but the delegation is unaware of any such intimidations.
Please come to an end. I would like to ask the distinguished delegate from Eritrea to use a language in the future that is adequate for this Council and preserves the integrity of our mechanisms. The Commission is not ignorant, and they don't have a sinister political agenda, and this is not a travesty of justice. I must reject these formulations. Now we go into the speakers list. The first speaker is the European Union. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Commission of Inquiry. First of all, the European Union thank you for your hard work, and secondly, regret that the government did not grant you access. Eritrea should extend full cooperation to the Commission and implement its recommendations. The European Union is deeply concerned about your assessment that systematic, widespread and gross human rights violations have been committed in Eritrea. Your report describes a government-controlled system aimed at silencing individuals and denying their fundamental freedoms. We are deeply disturbed by your assessment that some violations may amount to crimes against humanity. We note how the situation in Eritrea impacts on the whole region, with an increasing number of Eritreans leaving their country and risking lives in the hands of traffickers. The European Union works closely with other countries to address this human trafficking problem, and the problem of irregular migration and its human rights challenges needs to be tackled collectively with the countries of origin, transit and asylum. We recognize that Eritrea is working through the EU-AU Khartoum process. As a question for the Commission, what are the most urgent steps that the government and the international community should take to address the root causes of the migration from Eritrea? The government's announcement to reduce the national service to 18 months could be an encouraging development in the interest of the Eritrean people. We stress the importance to provide full information on the implementation of this announcement. Secondly, you recommend that the government seek technical assistance? Which recommendations do you see best suited for this? And finally, let me reiterate again the call on the government to cooperate fully with this Council and its mechanisms, and to grant access to the Commission of Inquiry and to the Special Rapporteur. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. The delegation of Ghana is deeply saddened to learn from you, Mr. President, that at the beginning of this meeting, that members of the Commission of Inquiry on Eritrea have been subjected to orchestrated acts of harassment and intimidation since their arrival in Geneva, and wish to condemn those behind such attacks. Ghana commends the Commission for their comprehensive report shedding more light on the human rights situation in Eritrea. Ghana regrets that owing to the non-cooperation by the government of Eritrea, the Commission of Inquiry could not have the benefit of visiting Eritrea before writing its report. We note that the report mentions the progress made by Eritrea in addressing the health needs of the population, including reducing maternal mortality. Ghana also notes the acknowledgement by the Commission that Eritrea has submitted its periodic reports to the CEDAW and the Committee on the Rights of the Child. However, Ghana is concerned about the findings and conclusions of the report of the Commission highlighting systematic, widespread and gross human rights violations that have been committed by the government of Eritrea, in respect of which there is yet to be accountability. In the light of the Commission's findings and conclusions, Ghana wishes to urge the government of Eritrea to consider the recommendations made by the Commission, including the need to implement the Constitution of 1997, ensure the separation of powers between the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, and to release all those arbitrarily detained. It is recalled that the commitment made by African leaders under the Constitutive Act of the African Union to respect the rule of law, human rights and good governance was informed by our contemporary history of mass human rights violations, including in situations of violent civil wars that occurred in the African continent in the late 80s and early 90s. Ghana is also cognizant of the fact that while the Charter for the former Organization of the African Unity emphasized our sovereign independence, the Constitutive Act of the African Union gives equal attention to our growing interdependence and urges member states of the Union not to remain indifferent in the face of egregious violations of human rights and mass atrocities. On the basis of the African Union principle of non-indifference, as well as in the spirit of constructive solidarity with the people of Eritrea, Ghana wishes to appeal to the government of Eritrea to give serious consideration to the recommendations in the report of the Commission. Ghana also calls on the government of Eritrea to bring to justice all perpetrators who might have committed various human rights abuses identified by the Commission as possibly constituting crimes against humanity. Ghana further urges the government of Eritrea to collaborate with the Special Rapporteur in implementing her mandate and respond positively to her request for an invitation to visit Eritrea. To this end, it is our hope that the government of Eritrea will welcome the renewal by this Council of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is the distinguished delegate from the USA.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States thanks the Commission of Inquiry for its work and for the thorough and substantive report on the abhorrent human rights situation in Eritrea. On the basis of heart-wrenching testimony, including hundreds of interviews and written submissions, the Commission found that systematic, widespread, and gross violations of human rights have occurred and are occurring with no accountability, and that some of these violations may constitute crimes against humanity. The government has created and sustained a repressive system of control, silence, and isolate individuals in the country which deprive them of their ability to exercise fundamental freedoms. The Eritrean leadership rules through fear. Individuals are routinely arrested and arbitrarily detained, and at times tortured or disappeared. The Commission's work to document serious human rights violations in Eritrea must now lead to action. The Commission also described systems of national service and forced labor that it noted effectively abuse, exploit, and enslave the Eritrean people. We encourage the government of the state of Eritrea to honor its commitment to return the duration of the national service to 18 months for persons recruited since 2014 and treat all recruits humanely. This would send a positive signal to the international community and Eritrean people. Significantly more has to be done, however, to address the violations the report describes. The Eritrean government must hold free, fair, and transparent democratic elections, develop an independent and transparent judiciary, and release persons arbitrarily detained, including members of the G15, journalists, and members of religious groups. The government of the state of Eritrea must urgently work towards an end to the violations described in the COI's report. Commissioners, we are shocked by the reports of harassment against you. They should be fully investigated. Are there specific diplomatic or programmatic actions in addition to those already highlighted in the report that you suggest member states consider in this regard? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is distinguished delegate from the Czech Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. We support the statement delivered by the European Union. We thank the members of the Commission of Inquiry for their work and for the report which brought to our attention systematic, widespread and gross human rights violations in Eritrea. We regret that the repeated requests for cooperation of the government of Eritrea have not received response and that members of the Commission did not have the opportunity to visit the country. We are appalled by the Commission's findings that the human rights violations have been and are being committed under the authority of the government and that some of them in the areas of extrajudicial executions, torture, national service and forced labor may constitute crimes against humanity. As mentioned by the Commission, it is not law that rules Eritreans but fear. The non-implementation of the 1997 Constitution, which contains provisions on individual rights, and the suspension of the National Assembly, which stopped convening in 2002, have resulted in a situation where there is no rule of law in Eritrea. Reported surveillance of the population, restricted freedom of movement, opinion and expression, arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances and arbitrary killings alarm us. We therefore call on the government of Eritrea to ensure the implementation of the 1997 Constitution, to acknowledge the existence of human rights violations and ensure accountability, to allow the creation of political parties and hold free and fair elections at all levels. We would be interested to know what were the main difficulties and challenges for the work of the Commission when investigating and documenting human rights violations on the basis of interviews with witnesses who had to leave their country and even in diaspora are living under the fear of potential surveillance. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from Australia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Australia thanks the Commission of Inquiry for its report, and we are concerned to hear of threats to the Commission's safety. Australia is deeply concerned by the report's findings that the government of Eritrea is responsible for systematic, widespread and gross human rights violations. Australia is disappointed to see that the Commission, like the Special Rapporteur before it, has been unable to visit Eritrea to comprehensively fulfil its mandate. This is also disappointing given that Eritrea has accepted recommendations on cooperating with UN special procedures. Australia is deeply concerned by the widespread and systematic human rights violations raised in the Commission's report, including that Eritreans are subjected to systems of national service and forced labour that effectively abuse, exploit and enslave them for indefinite periods of time. We are concerned by the Commission's findings that alleged violations of human rights in relation to extrajudicial executions, torture, including sexual torture, and forced labour may amount to crimes against humanity. Perpetrators of such crimes must be held to account. Australia again encourages Eritrea to implement fully the 1997 Constitution and the rights that it enshrines, including allowing independent political parties and civil society to function freely. We would be interested to hear the Commission's views on mechanisms to address the accountability issues raised in its report. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is distinguished delegate from China.
Mr. President, China has always been in disagreement with the imposition of country-specific human rights resolutions and external investigation mechanisms. Judging from relevant reports, such mechanisms have limited means in obtaining information. Their interlocutors are rather homogeneous, and therefore the findings are often not objective nor comprehensive, resulting in systematic inaccuracies and cannot truly reflect the country's human rights situation. Eritrea is an economically underdeveloped developing country. Its human rights problems are often due to constraining factors such as economic and management capabilities. China in particular notes that prolonged sanctions have brought negative impact to its economic development and livelihood, as well as negative consequences on its human rights situation. China urges the international community to view objectively the actual difficulties facing Eritrea in protecting and promoting human rights and provide it with technical assistance and capacity building support according to its will and needs, engage in constructive dialogue and exchange, resolve differences and misunderstanding to effectively promote continuous progress in Eritrea's human rights cause. Thank you.
Is the distinguished delegate from Belgium.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, President. Belgium aligns itself with the European Union Declaration and also regrets the intimidatory acts against the members of the Commission of Inquiry. We thank the members of the Commission for their report on the human rights situation in Eritrea. The violations reported are serious and deplorable. Eritrea has ratified the main UN human rights instruments, but the reports show that the government is falling short of its obligations. The abuse of military conscription, for example, violates political, economic and social rights and is the reason for many decisions to leave and clandestinely emigrate. We support the Commission of Inquiry's recommendations and in particular call upon the Asmara government to open a dialogue with the international community, including the representatives of the Council that are the Special Rapporteur and the Commission of Inquiry. We call on the government as well to take up the spirit and letter of the 1997 Constitution by providing guarantees to bring an effective end to military service of unspecified duration and to open a political and societal debate with younger generations. Protracted conflict with a neighbouring country is not a pretext for not respecting international legal obligations to which the independent states subscribed and which are largely incorporated into domestic law via the 1997 Constitution. Can the members of the inquiry provide us with some proposals concerning measures to put a stop to human trafficking and abductions, which are particularly common on clandestine migration routes that start in Eritrea? Thank you.
Speaker is distinguished delegate from Djibouti.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
Which is to commend the Commission on Human Rights in Eritrea for the outstanding work undertaken despite the refusal by the government of Eritrea to allow access into the country. We deplore the continued non-cooperation of the government of Eritrea in the Council's mechanisms. The Commission objectively and transparently based its findings on a reliable body of first-hand accounts by a large number of victims who delivered poignant testimonies at confidential interviews and through written submissions. We are alarmed by the widespread and systematic pattern of a large array of human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrest and detention, torture and inhuman prison conditions, violations of freedom of expression and opinion, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion and belief, freedom of movement and forced military conscription. Of particular concern to Djibouti is the situation of hopeless Eritrean migrants who resort to dangerous escape routes and who risk capture, torture and death at the hands of ruthless human traffickers. We in Djibouti continue to feel pain and anguish because of the lack of information about the whereabouts and health of the Djibouti prisoners of war held incommunicado in Eritrean prisons. On behalf of the co-sponsors, Somalia and Cameroon, Djibouti has circulated a proposed draft resolution on the human rights situation in Eritrea, which inter alia calls on the government of Eritrea to take immediate and concrete steps to implement the recommendations made by the Commission. in its report and proposes to extend the mandate of the Commission to investigate the extent to which human rights violations and abuses identified by the Commission in its first report constitute crimes against humanity. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Let me say that the list of speakers is closed. Let me also say that this was the last speaker we could accommodate today because we have some rights of reply.